Before I speak on the topic, let me be clear. I'm not here to give you false hope. I'm not saying the avoidant is guaranteed to love you in the way you want. As we go deeper inside the video, you will realize what exactly I am talking about. Now let's start. You wonder whether the avoidant who hurt you through their patterns could genuinely change. Whether the person who withdrew and deactivated and demonstrated emotional unavailability throughout relationship could transform into partner capable of sustaining intimate reciprocal partnership. You hear stories about avoidants who did change, read accounts of people whose avoidant partners eventually developed capacity for healthy relationship. Encounter narratives suggesting that with right circumstances or right person or sufficient motivation, avoidants can overcome their defended limitations and build sustainable intimacy. These stories activate hope that perhaps the avoidant you knew could transform. Perhaps their patterns are not fixed, permanent limitations, but are changeable through sufficient crisis or sufficient desire or sufficient recognition of what they lost when they lost you. Yet genuine avoidant transformation is extraordinarily rare, so statistically uncommon that hoping for or waiting for transformation represents poor strategy for your well-being and your future. The rarity stems from multiple factors that make transformation unlikely. Avoidance defensive structure actively resists the vulnerability that therapeutic work requires. Their patterns provide sufficient defended comfort. That motivation for difficult change work remains minimal, despite relationship losses. Their psychology includes sophisticated rationalization mechanisms that prevent facing their responsibility for relationship failures. The therapeutic work required for genuine transformation demands years of sustained, uncomfortable effort that most avoidants abandon when initial discomfort exceeds their tolerance. Most avoidants cycle through relationships, losing valuable partners to unchanged patterns, while never engaging the therapeutic work that would address those patterns, remain defended throughout their lives, experiencing chronic loneliness, yet unwilling to do vulnerable internal work that would allow genuine connection, die having never achieved the intimate partnership they claimed to want, because defenses they refused to examine prevented them from sustaining intimacy. The rare avoidant who does genuinely transform demonstrates specific concrete evidence that distinguishes genuine change from temporary crisis-driven performance or from superficial adjustment that leaves defensive structure fundamentally unchanged. Genuine transformation includes sustained engagement with trauma-informed therapy, specifically addressing attachment wounds and defensive patterns, includes developed capacity to identify and express emotions that previously remained suppressed, includes practiced vulnerability in relationships, demonstrating ability to share authentic self without defended barriers, includes maintained intimate partnership across years. Proving capacity is sustainable rather than temporary, includes genuine accountability for past harm their patterns created without defensive minimization or blame shifting. These concrete indicators reveal that defensive structure has been examined and restructured rather than simply being temporarily overridden by crisis motivation that fades once crisis passes. Understanding what genuine transformation looks like and recognizing why such transformation is so rare protects you from wasting time hoping for change that is statistically unlikely to occur, protects you from returning to person based on temporary performance you mistake for genuine transformation, protects you from organizing your life around waiting for someone to become capable of partnership they have consistently demonstrated they cannot sustain. The protection comes from developing realistic assessment of what change requires and what evidence demonstrates change has occurred, from recognizing that most avoidants never achieve genuine transformation, regardless of how much pain their patterns cause themselves and others, from understanding that your well-being and your future deserve investment in present reality, rather than in hoped-for potential that statistics and psychology suggest will almost certainly never materialize into actual sustained transformed capacity. Genuine transformation requires years of trauma-informed therapy, not months of self-reflection. The avoidant who genuinely transforms engages sustained trauma-informed therapy over multiple years, typically 3 to 5 years minimum of consistent weekly sessions with therapists trained in attachment theory and in healing developmental trauma. This extended time frame is necessary because avoidant defensive structure developed over years or decades of childhood experiences cannot be restructured through brief intervention or through self-directed reflection without professional guidance. the attachment wounds that created defensive patterns formed during critical developmental periods, when brain was forming relational templates, when child was learning how emotions and needs and vulnerability should be managed based on caregiver responses. These deeply encoded patterns require extensive professional work to identify, understand, and restructure, because patterns operate largely outside conscious awareness as automatic responses that feel like inherent personality rather than like learned defenses that can be changed. The trauma-informed therapy specifically must address attachment wounds rather than focusing solely on surface behaviors or current relationship problems. Generic therapy or counseling that discusses relationship difficulties without examining childhood attachment experiences and without addressing how those experiences created current defensive patterns proves insufficient for genuine transformation. The avoidant must work with therapist who understands that withdrawal patterns stem from childhood experiences where emotional expression led to rejection or dismissal, that emotional unavailability reflects learned suppression of feelings that were not acceptable or safe to express, that defended independence developed as protection against needs that childhood caregivers could not or would not meet consistently. Without this attachment-focused framework, therapy might address superficial behavioral changes, might help avoidant learn to text more consistently or to show up for plans more reliably, without addressing underlying defensive structure that generates problematic patterns. The sustained engagement means consistent attendance across years without the avoidant quitting when therapeutic work becomes uncomfortable or triggering. Many avoidants begin therapy during relationship crisis or after significant loss, attend several sessions while crisis motivation remains high, then discontinue when therapist begins examining childhood wounds or when vulnerability required for healing activates defensive anxiety. Genuine transformation requires pushing through this discomfort rather than fleeing when vulnerability feels overwhelming, requires continuing therapy when every defensive instinct screams to quit and restore defended barriers, requires tolerating activation of suppressed emotions and painful memories that examining wounds necessarily creates, requires maintaining commitment to process even when progress feels slow or when therapeutic work destabilizes comfortable defended equilibrium they maintained before beginning examination of patterns. The trauma-informed approach also requires the avoidant engage experiential work beyond cognitive understanding, requires actually feeling and processing emotions rather than simply intellectualizing about patterns, requires practicing vulnerability in therapeutic relationship rather than maintaining defended presentation even with therapist, requires revisiting and metabolizing childhood wounds rather than keeping those wounds suppressed through continued defensive avoidance. Many avoidants can develop intellectual understanding of their patterns through reading about attachment theory or through discussing patterns in therapy while maintaining complete emotional distance from that understanding. Intellectual understanding alone does not transform defensive structure. Transformation requires emotional experiencing and processing that allows old wounds to heal and allows new relational capacities to develop through practice rather than through cognitive insight alone. The genuine transformation through sustained therapy manifests through specific developments that demonstrate restructured defensive capacity rather than surface behavioral changes. The avoidant develops ability to identify their emotions in real time rather than remaining disconnected from emotional experience, can recognize when they feel anxious, sad, overwhelmed, hurt, rather than experiencing only physical sensations or vague discomfort. They develop capacity to express emotions to partner in vulnerable way rather than suppressing or intellectualizing feelings, can say, "I feel scared about getting closer," rather than simply withdrawing without explanation or rationalizing withdrawal through criticizing partner. They develop tolerance for intimacy that previously triggered defensive withdrawal, can sustain emotional closeness across time rather than needing to create distance whenever intimacy exceeds previous tolerance level. Understanding that genuine transformation requires years of trauma. Informed therapy protects you from accepting claims of change based on brief self-reflection or short-term counseling. The avoidant who returns after several months claiming they have worked on themselves or done a lot of thinking without evidence of sustained professional trauma. Informed therapy has not done the work genuine transformation requires. Self-reflection alone cannot access unconscious defensive patterns, cannot provide the safe relationship context where vulnerability can be practiced, cannot offer the professional guidance needed to restructure deeply encoded attachment patterns. Short-term counseling focusing on communication skills or current relationship issues without addressing attachment wounds, treats symptoms without addressing underlying defensive structure, ensuring patterns will resurface once surface improvements prove insufficient to address fundamental defended limitations. The protection also comes from recognizing that most avoidants never engage the sustained trauma-informed therapy transformation requires, never because the work is too uncomfortable, too lengthy, too expensive, too vulnerable, too destabilizing of defended equilibrium. They prefer maintaining despite cost to relationships. The statistical rarity of genuine transformation reflects that most avoidants quit therapy or never begin therapy, preferring to maintain defended patterns despite relationship failures those patterns create. Recognizing this statistical reality protects you from waiting or hoping for transformation that is unlikely to occur, from organizing your life around potential that probably will never materialize, from sacrificing your present well-being for future possibility that statistics suggest will remain forever unrealized potential, rather than becoming actual demonstrated sustained transformed capacity. Real change shows in sustained behavior across years, not intense promises during crisis. The avoidant experiencing crisis, crisis of losing you, crisis of failed replacement attempts, crisis of facing loneliness their patterns create, crisis of recognizing patterns cost them valuable relationships, often makes intense promises about change during peak crisis motivation. They promise they will do whatever it takes to make relationship work, promise they will change patterns that destroyed previous relationship, promise they recognize their issues and are committed to addressing them, promise this time will be different because now they understand what they lost and what needs to change. These crisis-driven promises feel compelling because intensity and apparent sincerity suggest genuine commitment to transformation, because promises address exactly the changes you needed them to make during relationship, because desperation in their expression seems to indicate they have finally reached breaking point that will motivate sustained change effort. Yet, crisis-driven promises almost never translate into sustained behavioral change across years, because promises reflect temporary crisis motivation rather than reflecting restructured defensive capacity. Crisis creates urgency that temporarily overpowers defensive resistance, creates intense desire to reverse consequences by promising whatever seems necessary to restore what crisis threatens to permanently eliminate. Yet crisis motivation fades as crisis resolves. Fades when immediate threat of loss is neutralized through you agreeing to try again. Fades when panic about loneliness is relieved through securing new relationship. Fades when facing consequences becomes less acute because time has passed since loss occurred. As crisis motivation fades, defensive patterns reassert because underlying defensive structure remains unchanged despite intense promises, crisis temporarily motivated. Genuine transformation demonstrates through sustained behavioral changes, maintained across years rather than through promises made during crisis. The genuinely transformed avoidant shows consistent emotional availability across months and years, remains emotionally present during calm periods and during stress, rather than withdrawing when overwhelmed, continues expressing feelings and maintaining vulnerability, rather than re-establishing defended barriers once crisis passes, sustains intimate engagement, rather than cycling between closeness and distance based on fluctuating defensive tolerance. They demonstrate reliable, consistent presence, shows up for partner across time, rather than being present initially, then becoming inconsistent as relationship continues, maintains relationship as priority, rather than deprioritizing once initial crisis motivation fades, follows through on commitments rather than pattern of promising then failing to deliver, when following through requires sustained effort. The sustained change particularly manifests through behavior during difficult relational moments that would have previously triggered defensive withdrawal or deactivation. When conflict arises, genuinely transformed avoidant stays, engaged working toward resolution rather than shutting down or creating distance, tolerates discomfort of disagreement without fleeing, expresses their perspective while remaining open to partner's experience, works collaboratively toward repair rather than defending through blame or withdrawal. When partner expresses needs or hurt, transformed avoidant receives communication without defensiveness, listens to understand rather than listening to defend or minimize, acknowledges impact their behavior, had rather than rationalizing or justifying, takes accountability without requiring partner, to soften legitimate concerns, to protect avoidance comfort. The sustained behavioral change also includes maintenance of therapeutic work and personal growth practices across years rather than engagement during crisis, followed by abandonment once crisis resolves. Genuinely transformed avoidant continues therapy or continues applying therapeutic insights across time, attends therapy consistently even when relationship is stable and crisis motivation has faded, practices vulnerability and emotional awareness as ongoing discipline rather than as crisis-driven temporary effort, maintains commitment to growth as lifelong process rather than as short-term fix applied until immediate crisis passes. This sustained engagement with growth demonstrates that transformation reflects changed identity and changed capacity rather than temporary override of defenses motivated by crisis. The years-long time frame is critical because initial months after crisis can include sustained behavioral changes that represent crisis-driven override rather than genuine transformation. The avoidant motivated by crisis of losing you can maintain increased emotional availability, consistent presence, vulnerable expression for weeks or months while crisis motivation remains active and while fear of loss remains acute. Yet if underlying defensive structure remains unchanged, patterns inevitably reassert once crisis motivation fades, once they have secured your renewed commitment reducing fear of loss, once several months of sustained effort exhaust their capacity for crisis-driven override, once comfortable defended equilibrium beckons, after extended period of uncomfortable vulnerable engagement. Patterns reasserting after months reveals initial changes were performance rather than transformation, were temporary override rather than restructured capacity. Understanding that real change shows in sustained behavior across years protects you from accepting crisis-driven promises or short-term behavioral improvements as evidence of genuine transformation. The avoidant who makes intense promises during crisis has not demonstrated anything except that crisis activates their desire to avoid consequences, has not demonstrated developed capacity for sustained change, has not shown evidence of therapeutic work restructuring defenses, has not proven through sustained behavior that capacity exists to maintain promised changes once crisis motivation fades. The avoidant who maintains behavioral changes for several months has demonstrated more than promises alone demonstrate, has shown some capacity for sustained effort. Yet months-long changes remain insufficient evidence of genuine transformation because crisis override can maintain changes across months before inevitable defensive reassertion occurs. The protection requires waiting for evidence of sustained change across multiple years before considering reconnection or before believing transformation is genuine. Multiple years of maintained changes, years of consistent emotional availability, years of reliable presence, years of practice vulnerability, years of continued therapy and growth work, provide evidence that changes reflect restructured defensive capacity rather than temporary crisis-driven override. The waiting protects you from returning prematurely based on promises or based on initial months of improvement, only to experience painful repetition when defensive patterns reassert after crisis, motivation fades, and unchanged underlying defensive structure resumes generating familiar problematic patterns that make relationship again unsustainable despite intense promises and initial apparent improvements that proved temporary rather than representing genuine sustained transformation. Transformed avoidants take full accountability without defensiveness or blame shifting. The genuinely transformed avoidant demonstrates radical shift in how they discuss past relationship failures and their role in creating relational harm, demonstrates through concrete observable communications that they have examined their defended patterns, understand how those patterns affected partners, take clear accountability for harm without defensive minimization or blame shifting. This accountability manifests through specific elements that distinguish genuine ownership from superficial apologizing, designed to restore relationship without genuine understanding or commitment to different behavior. The transformed avoidant can articulate their specific patterns with accuracy, can name their withdrawal, their emotional unavailability, their inconsistency, their defended resistance to intimacy as patterns they demonstrated, rather than vaguely acknowledging mistakes or issues without clear understanding of actual problematic behaviors. They can describe impact their patterns had on partner with empathic accuracy, can articulate how withdrawal created pain and confusion, how emotional unavailability left needs unmet, how inconsistency generated anxiety and insecurity, how defended limitations required partner to sacrifice themselves to maintain relationship. This empathic understanding demonstrates they have examined experience from partner's perspective rather than remaining focused exclusively on their own defended experience, demonstrates they recognize their patterns created legitimate harm rather than maintaining that partner was too sensitive or too demanding. They can connect their patterns to their attachment wounds and defensive structure, can explain how childhood experiences taught them to suppress emotion and avoid vulnerability, how defenses developed as protection yet created relational harm in adulthood, how their defended strategies for managing anxiety cost them intimate connections they actually desired beneath defenses. The accountability particularly includes taking responsibility without requiring partner to minimize harm or to share blame for relationship failure. The transformed avoidant does not say, "I know I withdrew, but you were too demanding," or "I was emotionally unavailable, but you were too emotional," does not append qualification that shifts partial responsibility to partner, or that suggests partner's reasonable needs or normal emotional expression contributed to relationship problems. The transformed avoidant says, "I withdrew when you needed me present, and my withdrawal harmed you," without adding defensive qualification, takes clear ownership of their behavior and its impact, without diluting accountability through blame sharing or through suggesting partners' responses to their patterns were part of problem requiring equal accountability. The accountability also includes genuine remorse about harm created rather than regret focused solely on consequences to themselves. The defensive avoidant expresses regret focused on their loss, regrets losing you, regrets experiencing loneliness, regrets facing consequences their patterns created. This self-focused regret reflects concern about how patterns affected them, rather than genuine remorse about how patterns affected partner. The transformed avoidant expresses remorse centered on partner's experience, expresses genuine sorrow about pain their patterns caused, communicates understanding that their defended behavior harmed person they claim to have cared about, demonstrates concern about partner's suffering, rather than focusing exclusively on their own loss or loneliness. This other-focused remorse indicates they have developed empathic capacity to feel genuine concern about harm they created, rather than remaining defended and self-focused. The genuine accountability without defensiveness extends to how transformed avoidant responds when partner expresses hurt or anger about past patterns. The defensive avoidant responds to partner's pain with minimization, suggests partner is dwelling on the past, implies partner should forgive and move on, becomes irritated that partner continues feeling hurt about patterns that avoidant has acknowledged. The defensive avoidant responds with justification, explains why they behaved as they did through describing their struggles and wounds, uses explanation as implied excuse, suggesting partner should understand rather than remaining hurt. The defensive avoidant responds with blame shifting, points to partner's responses to their patterns as evidence partner contributed to problems, suggests partner's hurt feelings or anger prove partner was too reactive or too unforgiving. The transformed avoidant responds to partner's pain with validation and patience, acknowledges partner has right to feel hurt about legitimate harm, patterns created, demonstrates willingness to hear about impact without becoming defensive, maintains accountability even when partner's expression of pain feels uncomfortable or critical. The transformed avoidant allows partner to have feelings about past harm without requiring those feelings to be softened or minimized to protect avoidant's comfort, can tolerate partner's anger or hurt without shutting down conversation or without requiring partner to focus on avoidance growth or current struggles rather than on legitimate pain about past patterns. This capacity to receive partner's pain without defensiveness demonstrates emotional maturity and genuine accountability that defensive avoidant cannot demonstrate because defensive structure requires protecting against criticism or blame even when criticism accurately describes harm their patterns created. The transformed accountability also demonstrates through actions rather than through words alone, demonstrates through changed behaviors that address specific patterns. They take accountability for having demonstrated. The avoidant who takes accountability for withdrawal demonstrates through maintained presence rather than through continued pattern of withdrawal accompanied by apologies. The avoidant who takes accountability for emotional unavailability demonstrates through practiced emotional expression rather than through continued suppression, accompanied by acknowledgement that suppression is problematic. The avoidant who takes accountability for inconsistency demonstrates through reliable follow-through rather than through continued unreliability, accompanied by remorse about being unreliable. Accountability demonstrated through actions proves genuine understanding and commitment to change. Proves they comprehend not just that patterns were harmful, but how to behave differently in ways that prevent repeating harm they claim to take responsibility for creating. Understanding that transformed avoidants take full accountability without defensiveness protects you from accepting superficial apologies or partial acknowledgement as evidence of genuine transformation. The avoidant who apologizes while minimizing harm or while requiring you to acknowledge your contribution to problems has not achieved genuine accountability, has achieved only partial recognition that serves to restore relationship without facing full weight of responsibility their patterns deserve. The avoidant who expresses regret focused on their loss rather than genuine remorse about your pain has not developed empathic capacity transformation requires, remains self-focused despite apparent acknowledgement of patterns. The avoidant who explains their patterns through describing wounds without taking clear accountability for harm, those patterns created uses explanation as excuse rather than demonstrating genuine ownership that separates understanding origins from justifying impact. The protection requires evaluating accountability through multiple conversations across time rather than through single conversation during crisis when they are motivated to say whatever seems necessary to restore relationship. Genuine accountability remains consistent across multiple discussions, remains non-defensive when partner raises hurt repeatedly, maintains clear ownership without qualification across time, demonstrates through sustained behavior that accountability translates into different actions. Superficial crisis-driven accountability shifts when tested, becomes defensive when partner does not quickly move past hurt, adds qualifications about partner's role when initial apology does not immediately restore relationship, fails to translate into behavioral change. Proving accountability was verbal performance rather than genuine understanding and commitment to different behavior that genuine transformation creates through therapeutic work, examining defended patterns and their impact. Why transformation is so rare. The work directly threatens the defenses that feel essential to survival. Genuine avoidant transformation requires examining and restructuring the defensive patterns that avoidance psychology experiences as essential protection rather than as optional adaptations that can be modified or eliminated. The defensive structure developed during childhood in response to environment where emotional expression led to rejection or punishment, where vulnerability resulted in abandonment or dismissal, where needs for comfort or connection were met inconsistently or were criticized as weakness or burden. The child experiencing these responses learned at fundamental psychological level that expressing emotion creates danger, that showing vulnerability leads to harm, that having needs results in rejection, learned that survival requires suppressing emotions, avoiding vulnerability, denying needs to maintain whatever limited connection or safety was available in inadequate caregiving environment. These learned defensive strategies became encoded as automatic responses operating outside conscious awareness, became part of psychological structure that feels like inherent personality rather than like learned adaptation to specific environment. The adult avoidant experiences their emotional suppression, their defended independence, their resistance to vulnerability, not as choices they make, but as fundamental aspects of who they are, experiences suppression as normal baseline, rather than as defensive response, experiences independence as natural preference, rather than as protection against needs that childhood taught would not be met, experiences resistance to vulnerability as reasonable caution rather than as defended barrier preventing intimacy. The defensive structure feels protective rather than limiting, because defenses successfully prevented repeated experiences of childhood harm, successfully prevented rejection by eliminating emotional expression that led to rejection, successfully prevented abandonment by avoiding vulnerability that resulted in abandonment, successfully prevented disappointment by denying needs that were not met,